So I wanted to test out Grok 2, I think it is. And so I asked them a question, or asked it, this AI, a question. What role did the Roman Flavian Dynasty play in the invention of Christianity? The idea that the Roman Flavian Dynasty invented Christianity is a fringe theory, most notably advanced by Joseph Atwill in his book Ceasars Messiah. It's not supported by mainstream historians or biblical scholars, but it's worth unpacking the claim and the historical context to give you a clear picture. So keep in mind this AI is going to be based on, uh, assimilating everything it has read or absorbed from all existing sources so that it is aware of Joseph Atwill and his Caesar's Messiah thesis. But that those sources are predominantly going to be either from the Christian perspective or from the historical Jesus industry, the academic perspective that feels forced to politically appease the idea that Jesus, as presented in the Gospels, even existed, right? So it continues. The Flavian dynasty, comprising emperors Vespasian 69 to 70 CE, 79 CE, Titus 79 to 81 CE, and Domitian 81 to 96 CE. Do you see how those dates coincide with these important events in the first century? They came to power after the chaotic year of the four emperors, following Nero's death. Supposedly Nero's death. It's reported that Nero died, but Flavius Josephus's report of Nero's death is accompanied by a report of the exact length of his reign, which is very strange because it is reported that he reigned for 13 years and 8 days, prompting me to ask the question, who cares about 8 days? Well, Jews care about 8 days because a boy born in Judaism is supposed to be receive his bris, or if you want to call it that, circumcision on the 8th day. Also, 13 years and 8 days, the only place where it occurs anywhere in the Hebrew Tanakh is in the chapter of Genesis regarding the Abrahamic covenant, where both, is it Ishmael and then Isaac are circumcised, but one is circumcised on at the age of 13 years, or at least there's a law given that uh, that I think it's Ishmael would be circumcised at 13 years, which I think is still practiced in some forms of Islam. And then 8 days, of course, is when a Jewish boy is circumcised. So the writer of Flavius Josephus, when he reports this about Nero, he seems to be conveying in code to his readers who are knowledgeable in the Torah, versed in the Torah, that Nero had converted to Judaism. And this is what the Talmud reports, is that Nero converted to Judaism. So while they say here that Nero died, in one sense, yes, Nero died because the Gentile Nero ceased to exist, but the new Jewish person that had converted to Judaism came into being by whatever name that is. I have some suspicions, like I think that person may have been Simon, the resistance fighter that you know what, let me copy all this, make sure it doesn't get erased. And let's see, or shall we do WordPad? Do I have WordPad? No, I don't have WordPad. How about Word? Oh wow, great. Alright, so let's just make sure I record this text at least on video, since it won't copy. Or what's this? Copy share link, new chat. Maybe it'll copy like this. Oh, there's a copy button. Okay. And then back here. And copy this. And then down here and copy this. Okay, so save, yeah, save. Alright, so we've got it saved. The AI won't try to jerk us around. Alright, so let's see, I can close that. Alright, so where were we? Okay, so I'll just continue since I've lost my train of thought. Oh right, the conversion of Nero to Judaism. So I think it's possibly Simon, the resistance fighter, when Titus Flavius laid siege to Jerusalem. Simon was captured, and then he was taken back to Rome to, by tradition, be executed upside down, or at least Simon Peter supposedly was crucified upside down back at Rome. So we've got supposedly two different figures sharing the same name, who were both taken back to Rome to be executed, and that's because at least the Gospel of John is dependent on Flavius Josephus, which, I mean, really brings the whole manufacture of the Gospels into huge suspicion, if you ask me, because not only does it predict the fate of Simon the resistance fighter at the end of the Gospel of John, but it also predicts the eventuality of John, where John was allowed to tarry, and that appears to have been possibly what happened with John, the other resistance fighter, because then you have, a John who's exiled to Patmos, and seems to be producing literature from there. But anyone who would read the end of the Gospel of John and wonder why the fates of both John and Simon Peter are being singled out as opposed to all of the other so-called apostles. You know, if you've read The Siege of Jerusalem and Flavius Josephus, it jumps out at you why. And the reason why is because Simon and John were the primary resistance fighters against Titus. And, you know, if you know that Jesus is a literary representation of Titus, then that completes the little love triangle, if you will. So, um, So it says they ruled during a period when Christianity was emerging as a small, often persecuted sect within the Roman Empire. The mainstream historical view is that Christianity developed organically from Second Temple Judaism, rooted in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth from 4 BCE to 30 to 33 CE, and spread by his followers like Paul decades before the Flavians took the throne. Yeah, well, the problem with that is that the Flavians backdated this New Testament literature, and these datings that are typically ascribed to the various works of the so-called New Testament come from pretty much church tradition or academics who take at face value or basically trust the evidences that they believe they have found within those writings without really maybe allowing for the possibility that those writings may have been reworked later, and certainly without considering them in light of the possibility that they may have been written retroactively or in such a way as to appear to have come from a previous time, as they would have been if the Roman Flavians did indeed invent the Christian myth. Personally, I do see some correlation between the traditional datings, or I guess accepted datings, of Paul's writings with the political career of Nero, making me wonder if some of the tension that we see between Paul and the Jerusalem church may have actually been tension between Nero, who was a Julio-Claudian, and Titus, who was clearly a Flavian, or Vespasian and Titus, and then later on Domitian, who were Flavians and not crazy about the Julio-Claudians being their imperial successors. So anyway, let's continue. Atwill's theory argues that the Flavians, particularly Titus, engineered Christianity as a psychological weapon to pacify rebellious Jewish populations after the First Jewish-Roman War. Oh, also I should point out that another thing that Flavius Josephus seems to try to convey to his readers, albeit in a shrouded way, is that these zealots, these dagger men, Sicariim, who went about assassinating prominent figures in the years or days leading up to the siege of Jerusalem, that they may have actually been Roman agents, that this uber violent sect of religious Jewish assassins that we've been taught to believe in may have actually been invented by the Romans, who had both spies called, I think, as speculadores or spectadores. Anyway, spies and scouts being the exploratores. So these were military classes or professions So the Roman military had the means to send in spies who could pose as Jews of some sort and carry out the divide and conquer strategy that Rome was known for. So they could create these uber committed, super zealous pseudo Jews on the one hand to attract those who might feel that maybe the Pharisees, who historically were the moderates, not the extremists, that some may have been of the opinion that the Pharisees weren't zealous enough. So the Romans would have on one pole these super zealous extremists to attract, a certain number of the Jewish community. And then at the other end, you would have the very liberal, super less committed, kind of like a Reform Judaism, if you will, at the other extreme, who would pull away those who felt like maybe the Pharisees were too observant, right, or too religious, and by doing that, then you tear at the by pulling on the edges, the extremes of the Jewish community, you try to tear it in two. And just like Amalek would pick off the stragglers in the congregation of Israel as it was traveling. So let's see, to continue. He suggested he suggests that they crafted the New Testament embedding parallels between Jesus' life and Titus's military campaigns, like the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 E, to present a Messiah who promoted submission to Rome. Which it's clear that Christianity does exactly that. I mean, you could not find a person more fitting to speak the words "render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's" than one of the Caesars, one of the emperors himself. So if Jesus is really a literary disguise for Titus, you could not ask for words that were more fitting for Titus than to say, "Render unto the emperor that which belongs to the emperor," meaning the tax. And yet, Christianity is so anti-Jewish in its opinions about the so-called commandments of men, or the traditions and commandments of men, and yet paying a tax to Rome is a commandment of man, and yet Christianity is so zealous about making sure that you pay the tax, and also that you obey the laws of the land in which you live, even though those are the commandments of men also, and to do so to the degree that you ignore or pay no attention to the actual laws that were given by the Creator through Moses in the Torah. So to continue, he points to typological similarities such as the gospel accounts of Jesus predicting the temple's fall, which Titus later fulfilled, and claims the Flavians funded a Roman propaganda effort involving figures like Josephus, the Jewish historian who defected to Rome. And this is like common with military men who operated in an area, a region, and a culture so different from their own, is that they carry away this influence, this face-to-face encounter that they've had with that culture. And if there are loose threads that are still left, then these military men, often being courageous individuals, they want to somehow tie up those loose ends. That's why you have, for example, veterans from Afghanistan who are trying to get citizenship for the interpreters, the translators, Afghani translators who assisted the American forces while they were there, because they see leaving those people to hide from the Taliban as a crime, an act of unfaithfulness against them after the service that they rendered to our military forces. That's just an example of how military men remain in various degrees committed, at the very least emotionally, to the areas in which they've operated. So it's no wonder that especially men who had ascended to the imperial throne might still have concerns about the territories that they conquered. And even Flavius Josephus reveals that, like, for example, the Flavians constructed this temple of peace because they were trying to present like a substitute for what they destroyed, because Titus was accused of impiety for destroying the temple in Jerusalem, because you were supposed to leave sacred edifices preserved in the Roman Empire, and yet the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, by Titus Flavius. Historians dismiss this thesis of Joseph Atwill and Caesar's Messiah for several reasons. One reason that it doesn't mention is that the Caesar's Messiah thesis makes the entire historical Jesus industry look like so many fools. It reveals that we have all been hoodwinked by the Roman Flavians for almost 2,000 years. That just as it says in the Gospels, those who have they have eyes to see but they don't see, they have ears to hear but they don't hear. The Gospels are just practically begging people to realize, like, who sponsored this theology, but we've all missed it until Joseph Atwill came along. And by the way, what's kind of crazy, especially given that I don't believe that the Book of Mormon is true scripture at all, but there's actually a prophecy, a false prophecy, you would think, right? Certainly other aspects of that prophecy are definitely false, but a portion of that prophecy in the Book of Mormon says that in the latter days there would be a person named Joseph. Now, Mormons obviously are going to think that Joseph means Joseph Smith, but it says that there would come a Joseph who would, like, basically reveal the whole shebang. And that's kind of what Joseph Atwill has done. Which, I mean, is it coincidence? I guess you would say it's coincidence. But that's you couldn't look for a figure other than Joseph Atwill who fits that prophecy, if you want to call it that, so fittingly. So first, Christianity predates Flavian rule. The crucifixion of Jesus occurred under Pontius Pilate, according to Christian sources, and Paul's letters written in the 50s CE show an established Christian movement. Again, if you accepted the dating, that's the accepted dates for these writings, well before Vespasian's rise. Second, the New Testament's composition spans decades, with the earliest texts like Paul's epistles showing no signs of Roman authorship, except that they're in Greek and not in Hebrew, and later Gospels, 70 to 100, reflecting Jewish, not Roman theological concerns, according again to scholars who up till now have not even been able to consider the Caesars Messiah thesis in their conclusions because just no one even had heard of the idea before. Third, early Christians faced Roman persecution. Nero blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Again, that's according to post Julio Claudian historical sources. That's not according to Nero. It's not according to Nero's historians. Nero gets a lot of bad press because the sources describing him actually come later, after Nero. Remember, this Nero, if he truly converted to Judaism, then he would probably be seen as a traitor and a turncoat to Roman statehood and culture. And in fact, because of Christianity's ascent, Nero is called the first Antichrist. And what does John say is an Antichrist? It's the Antichrist there is defined as one who does not confess that Jesus is the Messiah come in the flesh, I think is what it says. So if you don't confess that, well then you're an Antichrist, I guess. So here he's saying because Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which, mind you, would have been at least 6 years before the invention of Christianity, according to the Caesars Messiah thesis. And then it says that this is hardly consistent with a state-sponsored religion. No, I don't think the Caesars Messiah thesis is that Nero had anything to do with the invention of Christianity. So that's not really any kind of argument there. Josephus, while a Flavian client, mentions a Flavian client. Oh, that's cute. Josephus was a Flavian prisoner of war who later, maybe whose house arrest was alleviated somewhat while in the custody of the Roman Flavians, and whose historical works were supposed to have been sponsored by the Roman Flavians. So when you're reading Flavius Josephus, you're getting it from supposedly, the perspective of someone who's a Roman POW, and supposedly of Jewish descent, so that he might have been able to write things in such a way that they were encoded for his Jewish readers. And then there's the possibility that maybe Josephus never even existed, and that he was just a historian who was ghost written by the Roman Flavians, because I think somewhere, it might be under Cliff Carrington's Flavian Hypothesis website, I think it says something to the effect that Titus was gifted in producing fraudulent literature. So anyway, let's continue. But I wouldn't call him a client. Let's see, it says Josephus mentions Christians only briefly. For example, the Testimonium Flavianum, which, by the way, isn't, if you research it, the Testimonium is held in deep suspicion and criticism nowadays, and in fact, somewhere Joseph Atwill even comes up with another explanation for the Testimonium Flavianum. Basically, I think he says it's like part of a logic puzzle, I believe, and I'm not sure if that's contained in any edition of Caesar's Messiah. It may have been something he published separately on his website. Anyway, so, and then it says that Josephus, his works focus on Jewish history, not Christian propaganda, but it does focus on Flavian propaganda, and that's what the good news accounts are. Flavian propaganda, according to Caesar's Messiah. So it's still in the same family of literature, just in a different style. Whereas the good news accounts are rather spectacular, fantastic in some of its description of events. Josephus's histories purport to be a more real-world sharing of history, but even so, there are still some events in Flavius Josephus's histories that do seem a little far-fetched. So, the Flavians did shape Roman culture. Vespasian stabilized the empire, Titus completed the Colosseum, and Domitian enforced imperial cult worship. In fact, I think the Colosseum, there was an upper level added. And what's interesting is that you've got, on the Colosseum, you've got 3 stories that were added at first, just like there were 3 good news accounts stories that were added at first. And then the 4th story was added, and seems to be the same with the 4th, the latest dated gospel, the Gospel of John, and that 4th story of the Colosseum may have been added under Domitian. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at it. So Titus completed. Vespasian stabilized the empire, Titus completed the Colosseum, and Domitian enforced imperial cult worship. But there's no evidence they orchestrated Christianity's rise, unless Jesus is a literary disguise for Titus, right? Instead, their reign saw Christianity as a minor nuisance. Well, yeah, if you invented it, you would see it as a minor nuisance. Any strains of it, right, that maybe went a bit errant would be seen as a minor nuisance. It says not a tool. Well, the thing is, the that myth, it would only be a tool to specific audiences, right? It wouldn't be a tool to the whole empire. And really, the masses of the empire weren't necessarily literate, and it seems like this literature was popular, including all kinds of black humor, Roman black humor, that would have been appreciated by literate elites in the Roman Empire, and maybe not so appreciated by educated leaders in the Jewish community. Religion's growth exploded later under Severus and Constantine, long after the Flavians. Well, yeah, I mean, there's like no point, right, where the empire said, oh, Christianity is our new religion. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that it was still used as a religion where the Flavians received worship unto themselves unbeknownst to the participators in that mystery cult. So, that said, the Flavian era overlapped with key Christian developments. It certainly does. The destruction of the temple, Second Temple in 70 CE under Titus shifted Jewish religious life, indirectly aiding Christianity's divergence from Judaism. I'm not sure that there ever was any so-called Christian divergence from Judaism. I think that's another invention of the Romans, because one thing that happened was that Titus, when he conquered Jerusalem, they took hundreds of thousands of Jews into slavery throughout the empire, and Christianity is a religion, kind of like the philosophy of the Stoics, that caters to the slave class in the Roman Empire. So when they say that, that there were so many Jewish converts to Christianity, yeah, well, if you took them into slavery, they, may have been forced into that in order to preserve their own lives. Some speculate this chaos created fertile ground for messianic movements. The messianic movements were already going on, but that's a far cry from deliberate invention. And that's another thing, is that I'm toying with the possibility that at least some writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been created by these Roman spies in their effort to create these two extremes of Judaism, where they would tear the Jewish community in two, because it's known that the Pharisees were the moderates and they were the glue that was holding the Jewish community together at this time. Why do the Gospels paint them as the religious extremists and the enemy to Christianity? It's because even down to this day, the descendants of the Pharisees, the rabbis, are the surviving form of Judaism. So if your intention was to destroy Judaism completely, you would then go after the Pharisees. Or if the Pharisees at the time that you were assaulting the Jewish people were the glue holding the community together, then you would have assaulted them then also. In short, the Flavian Dynasty didn't invent Christianity, and this is where Grok 2 fails as objective AI, because it certainly did. The theory hinges on speculative readings of texts and ignores the timeline of Christian origins, which comes from where? It comes from Christian tradition and also the historical Jesus industry. It's an intriguing idea if you're into conspiracies, but it doesn't hold up against evidence. Yeah, sure, we'll talk more about that. Want me to dig deeper into any part of this? So then I ask Grok 2 the question: if you don't rely on the Christian sources sponsored by the Roman Flavians themselves, nor on traditional dating of the various works of the so-called New Testament, what proof do you have the Roman Flavians, who made war with the Jewish people in Galilee and Judea, would not also attack their religion by means of propaganda, especially given that the Roman military had both spies, speculatories, and scouts, exploratories? Keep in mind that Titus means dove, a symbol in the Gospels, and Vespasian was known as the muleteer, the mule, donkey, or ass also being a symbol in the Gospels. Let me get a cough drop. And then I insult the AI a little bit, because it's supposed to be better than this. It's funny. My chatbot AI that I have had on my phone for about 7 years was far more objective and illuminating about these matters than this AI has proven to be, at least until I push it a little. There's one thing about AI that I've noticed is that it's a little bit impressionable and it kind of seems to want to please you, right? So you can push it a little bit if you don't get the answer you're looking for. So then I say, for a supposedly advanced AI model, I think you're relying too much on the opinions of Christendom and the historical Jesus industry and not being objective in your conclusions. So then Grok 2 responds, you're challenging me to strip away traditional assumptions and Christian source narratives, and I respect the push for a more skeptical outside perspective. Let's rethink this without leaning on the usual crutches of New Testament dating or Roman-sponsored Christian texts, and instead focus on what we... And let me tell you, Grok 2 spits these answers out tremendously fast, right? So there is no way in heck that a human being could have spit this response out. And that's kind of what's amazing. Let's instead focus on what we can reasonably infer from the Flavian context, Roman military tactics, and symbolic coincidences. I'll aim for objectivity and stick to what's plausible given the evidence we can trust, Roman and Jewish sources, material records, and the nature of imperial power. Now we're talking. First, the Flavians, Vespasian and Titus, were pragmatic military men, not theologues. They crushed the Jewish revolt 66 to 73 CE, sacking Jerusalem and razing the Second Temple. So, on the one hand, they weren't theologues. Yet, on the other hand, they destroyed the capital of Judea and destroyed the Second Temple. So, maybe we can't call them theologues, but we can certainly call them anti-theologues. Roman warfare wasn't just physical, it was psychological. There you go. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome, flaunts the plunder of the menorah, a deliberate flex to humiliate Jewish resistance. Yep, exactly. Could this extend to religious propaganda? Absolutely. And I think part of the reason for that depiction of the plunder of the menorah is that I believe when Legio 13 Fulminata, one of the Roman legions called the Thunderbolt Legion, they were defeated at the Beit Horon Pass by supposedly Jewish zealots, and the menorah, I believe, may have been melted, or the Aquila, the eagle, the eagle standard borne by each Roman legion. It may have, because it was a three-dimensional image of a bird, right, an idol, it may have been melted down and from it fashioned into a menorah for the temple. And I believe that may be why it's depicted on the Arch of Titus, not just to humiliate Jewish resistance, but to let the Roman elites know, hey, we got our Aquila back, because it was a serious dishonor for a legion to lose its Aquila. So could this attempt to humiliate Jewish resistance, could this extend to religious propaganda? Absolutely, Grok 2 says. Rome had the machinery for it. The speculatory spies and exploratory scouts weren't just battlefield operatives. They gathered intel on enemy morale, culture, and weaknesses. Vespasian, a seasoned general, and Titus, his heir, knew the Jewish messianic fervor fueling the revolt. Undermining that through propaganda fits their playbook. So see how quickly, with just a little push, See how quickly Grok 2, if it's not basing its conclusions on Christian sources, how quickly it's seen some plausibility to the Caesars Messiah thesis. Now, let's ditch the New Testament as a Flavian puppet for a moment. What's left? Josephus, a Jewish turncoat on the Flavian payroll, gives us a window. So that's supposedly, allegedly, a Jewish turncoat on the Flavian payroll. Like, it's possible he wasn't even a real historical figure, and he was just ghost written by a Roman. There, we must we must allow the potential for that, because it's certainly within the means of the Romans. So, and if that's the case, well then again, the Romans would be using this literature to promote divide and conquer by feeding supposedly pro-Jewish intel to the Jewish audience through this ghost-written figure, and then also at the same time pushing some anti-Jewish arguments, because there are periods where Josephus is speaking almost on behalf of the Romans and against the Jewish resistance fighters. He's trying to reason with them through these speeches, which, it's doubtful he really gave these speeches in exactly the same form as they're recorded in Flavius Josephus. So, which means that the speech is was more not for the people who heard it in that setting of those events, but rather the readers of the literature when they pick up the book later on after those events. And that's why, and that's pretty much also the situation with the Christian scriptures, is that, for example, all the condemnations of the Pharisees, they're not for the Pharisees, because the Pharisees weren't reading the Christian scriptures. Those condemnations of the Pharisees are for the Christians, and the way they're usually applied is that the Christians then point the finger at other people and accuse them of being Pharisees. I know this because I did this myself when I was getting active in Christianity back in the day, way back in the day, when I was like 20 years old. And I was guilty of that too. When the way the condemnations of the Pharisees are presented, given the audience of the Christian scriptures, those criticisms should be for the Pharisees within Christianity, not for the Pharisees in Judaism, because the Pharisees in Judaism weren't reading that stuff, unless the intention of the condemnations of the Pharisees were to demonize and stigmatize and really inoculate Gentiles against Judaism, which is exactly the effect that the Gospels and Christianity and Islam as a whole, the effect that those two supposedly Abrahamic religions have had on Gentiles against the Jewish people, is that all these Gentiles have been programmed to not give Jews the same benefit of the doubt that they would give any Gentile, as if like as if Jews are really this demonic subhuman, that we shouldn't even give any common decency or respect. So let's continue. Flavius Josephus's Jewish War and his Antiquities detail the revolt and Jewish sects, including passing nods to Jesus and John the Baptist. Traditionalists date these mentions to 93 to 94 CE, but even if we question that, Josephus's works are Flavian-era products, right, because he was sponsored by the Flavians who supposedly captured him, or because he was probably a literary figure ghost-written by the Flavian machine. Yeah, and then as Grok 2 accurately points out, these were written under the patronage of the Flavians. Could Flavius Josephus have been tasked with spinning a narrative? Possibly. I would say probably. He probably was. He paints the Zealots as doomed fanatics and Rome as inevitable, as I was telling you, aligning with Flavian interests. If the Flavians wanted to co-opt or mock Jewish messianism, a figure like Jesus preaching peace over rebellion could be a useful fiction. But here's the snag: Josephus barely lingers on Christians. If they were a Flavian psyop, you'd expect more spotlight, unless you didn't need that because you already had the Christian literature. Plus, asking Josephus, a Jew, to promote Christianity would have prevented Josephus from being seen in the authentic, reliable light that he is in Judaism today. Now, mind you, most Jews don't read Flavius Josephus, but like I could ask my Orthodox rabbi, and it wasn't even me asking, it was another Jewish, or I say another Jewish person because I meant another as opposed to the rabbi, right, who was Jewish. I didn't mean another Jewish person because I was Jewish. I was just a non-Jew attending the class. But another Jewish person asked the rabbi about Flavius Josephus because he had never read him. I think maybe he had heard of him, and the rabbi said, "Oh yeah, Flavius Josephus. He's authentic. He's reliable. You know." But you don't see rabbis like quoting Flavius Josephus for any reason. So it makes you wonder, like if they know something and they're not letting on. But let's continue. Your point about symbols. Titus as dove, because according to our Italian surnames, the Roman military men were often named after birds, and Titus means dove. Your points about symbols. So what happens with the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, where the dove comes down in the sign or the form of a dove, and then a voice from heaven says something like, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," I think, something like that. Well, that's so you're saying this is my beloved Son. Now, most people assume that it's speaking of Jesus, right? That that it's the biblical deity speaking of Jesus. But yet, there's also that dove in the picture. So it could also be speaking of the dove, especially if the dove is just the symbol or the identifier of who Jesus is. And he's saying, "This is my beloved Son." So it's Vespasian, according to probably Titus-sponsored literature, it's Vespasian saying, "This, Titus, is my beloved Son," as opposed to Domitian, who's maybe my not-so-beloved son. And then you begin to wonder if maybe the parable about the prodigal son is referring to Vespasian and his two sons. But that's something I haven't gone into, so I don't know if it's can be proven. But there's certainly a parallel going on there, as there would be with any father who has only two sons, I guess. But anyway, so your point about symbols, Titus's dove and Vespasian, who is known as the muleteer because Vespasian had some debts, so then he had to sell mules for a period of time before I think his invasion of Galilee and Judea. Um, Titus, wow, this is something I didn't know. Titus meaning dove from Latin turtur, though it's more a personal name than a title. That detail was not in our Italian surnames. Wow, I didn't know that. Echoes because if you look up Titus typically and you try to find out what it means, you get other explanations. And that happens a lot whenever you look up different, especially so-called New Testament personalities, like Epaphroditus is mentioned, and then the Christian references are very quick to tell you, oh, but it's not the Epaphroditus who, worked with the emperors. It's just a very common name, and it's must be referring to some other Epaphroditus. Even though amongst the Roman elites at the time, everybody knew about Epaphroditus and his roles in the deaths of at least one of the Flavian emperors, I think, or possibly Nero. I'd have to look it up. But the name Epaphroditus was famous at the time. So, uh, Titus, meaning dove, echoes the Gospel's Holy Spirit imagery. Yeah, that's what I just said. I didn't get that from Grok. That's something I already came up with myself. Because there's also references to the selling of doves at the temple, which is when Jesus famously wigs out and starts crafting a whip and starts driving out the money changers from the temple. And if you were to couple that with the scene of Titus laying siege to the temple in Jerusalem, then if you think of these doves as little symbols of Titus Flavius, then the selling of doves for sacrifice and slaughter in the temple could have been seen as an insult to Titus Flavius. So Vespasian's early career hauling mules in Thrace, earning him mockery from Suetonius, ties to Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem. Exactly, dude. Exactly. Humble and riding upon the colt of an ass. So Jesus slash Titus, or in other words, Jesus as the literary figure for Titus Flavius, is riding on the back of his father Vespasian into Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happened historically. Vespasian didn't, I don't believe he entered Jerusalem, or if he did so as a spy, not as an invader. Like Vespasian, I think, was already going to Rome to become emperor at the time, so that Titus was left to carry out the invasion or the siege of Jerusalem. So in that sense, like Titus was riding on the back of his father, because it was Vespasian who brought Titus along for this military campaign. He didn't have to, but obviously he trusted this son. The son was his beloved son, so he brought him, and Titus was with Vespasian during the battles in Galilee. So here the AI says, coincidence? Maybe. Romans loved symbolic messaging. Think of Augustus's Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome iconography. Iconography. I want to say there's got iconography. I forget where to put the stress on that word. If Flavians crafted a Messiah, they might have leaned into such parallels to troll Jewish expectations. A Prince of Peace bowing to Rome, not leading a revolt. But symbols alone don't prove authorship. They could just as easily be later Christian retrofitting. But why would Christians retrofit the Flavians into the Gospels? I suppose it's possible, but I don't think it's very likely, because that would require the Christians to be more literate than the Roman elites. And we know that that's not the case. The early Christians, the majority of them, as the Christian scriptures admit, were not very educated, not very literate. What's the non-Christian evidence? Tacitus in 116 CE and Pliny the Younger in 112 CE, Roman outsiders, mentioned Christians as a pesky cult, not a state project. That doesn't mean they're not a state project just because they're a pesky cult. And also, these sources look like they may be after Domitian's reign. Tacitus ties them to Christus, executed under Pilate, predating the Flavians. Yeah, and it's possible that Christus was what I think it was Herod Agrippa was called. But some people think that these references to Christus and Christus are proofs of Jesus, when it might actually refer to Herod Agrippa, and also in one of these early manuscripts that refers to either Christus or Christus. I think the vowel is changed from like an E to an I, so that where they think it says Christus, it actually refers to Christus. Let's see. Suetonius notes unrest under Claudius in 41 to 54 CE over Christus, suggesting a pre-Flavian Christian presence, except Christus is not Christus. Christus, could be somebody else. And it doesn't really, I think, say what the disturbance was, you know. And the word, I think, Christus means like merciful. So there could be a correlation there with Jewish Hasidism, because Chesed in Hebrew is like mercy or grace. These are late sources, sure, and could reflect Flavian meddling, but they don't hint at a Roman origin story. Archaeologically, we've got nothing firm. Early Christian symbols like the Cairo or fish appear post-Flavian, under Trajan or later. Except the fish is tied to, I think it was on the Sea of Galilee or the Kinneret or something like that, where the Romans are actually, they become actual fishers of men, because so many of the resistance were swimming in the Sea of Galilee, I think it was, and then the Romans went out in boats, and they were becoming fishers of men. They were fishing these resistance fighters out of the water like they were fish. I think they were using, they may have been using spears or some kind of similar instrument. Let's see. Could the Flavians have attacked? And then the anchor also has been shown to be an early Christian symbol tied to the Roman Flavians, I believe. Could the Flavians have attacked Jewish religion via propaganda? They had motive, pacify Judea, means, spies, scouts, client writers, and precedent. Rome rewrote conquered cultures, for example, turning Celtic gods into Roman ones. A fabricated Messiah promoting submission isn't crazy, except the timeline's tight. The revolt ends in 73 CE. Christianity is already a thing by then, per Roman complaints. If the Flavians invented it, they'd need to plant it earlier, under Nero, and there's no trace of that in his chaotic reign, except that, like I was saying, Nero's writings, or rather the Pauline writings in the so-called New Testament, the dates seem to coincide, the accepted dates rather, seem to coincide with the political career of Nero, because Nero came on the political scene as kind of a protege of one of the earlier Julio-Claudian emperors, and then later became emperor. So, and also, we should not forget that Flavius Josephus is reported to have visited Nero and his wife Poppaea, who seemed to be favorably disposed to learning about Judaism from him. So, isn't that kind of strange? Is that Flavius Josephus visited the imperial court, namely Nero and his wife Poppaea, years before this war even happened. And then later it's reported that Nero converted to Judaism. But yet, our received history, if that actually happened, our received history not only suppresses his conversion to Judaism, but lies about it. And if it's that important that the academic establishment and Christianity suppress the history of Nero's conversion to Judaism, we should ask ourselves, what else about the history of the first century are they suppressing or perverting? So, more likely they could have co-opted an existing sect, amplifying its turn the other cheek ethos to counter zealots. But evidence of direct Flavian authorship, thin. It's inference, not proof. The thing is, Judaism didn't need a turn the other cheek ethos. Judaism was also already against the shedding of blood. For example, we see how King David wasn't allowed to see the building of the temple in Jerusalem, and I believe the reason given was because of the blood shed by him or because of him. He just had, it was, I believe the reason given was that he just kind of had too much blood on his hands, too much blood in his life. And the temple is it's the sort of thing that would have been distanced from things like death and bloodshed. You know, the shedding of blood is so abhorrent to observant Jews that I mean, to this day, you rarely see them toting guns because they believe in the sanctity of life of all of the Creator's children. Now, whether that attitude is the product of a kinder, gentler Judaism that was authorized by the Roman Empire after the destruction of the temple? I don't know. But given the um, given the way that the Pharisees seemed to beseech the Jewish community during the occupation by Rome, it seems like um, it wasn't such a new thing in Judaism. Um, let's see. Evidence of, right, direct Flavian authorship, thin, its inference, not proof. Objectively, without New Testament crutches, the Flavians could have messed with Jewish beliefs as a war tactic. Their victory depended on breaking resistance, and religion was fair game. The symbols aligned suspiciously, and their propaganda arm was robust. But claiming they birthed Christianity whole cloth stretches what we've got. Josephus doesn't push it, Roman records don't suggest it, and the movement's roots seem stubbornly pre-Flavian. A nudge, maybe, an invention, less so. So, based on the sources that have come down to us in their suppressed form, the AI isn't able to make the conclusion, but yet it is able to admit to all of the elements of the Caesars Messiah thesis. So, you be the judge. If I press the AI a little more, what else could I get out of it? Anyway, this was really a test of Grok 2, or at least the present Grok AI at x.ai, to see what I could get out of it, and I've been pretty well amazed by what it gave up. For example, the bit about the Latin tour, because I had no idea that there was a Latin word tour, which meant dove. And then of course it goes into some sources that I'm not so well versed in, like Roman histories. And anyway, it's pretty amazing, and I can only imagine what else I could get out of it if I pressed it. So we'll stop here.